If you are interested in exploring these topics further, learning and connecting with like-minded individuals, check out the 3 Patreon discussion groups available. Just visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and click the participate button. I also offer a free meditation group online every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Just go to any of my social media profiles for the link found in my link tree. There's no pressure to be on camera or to actively participate in any of these groups. Just come and listen and enjoy. Join an online spiritual community of everyday people committed to understanding the human experience more deeply through spiritual practices that we can apply to our everyday lives. Join us. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today we're going to take a look at life after death, or perhaps a better way to say it would be that we're going to examine what we as a consciousness might experience once our human body is no longer functioning. In all spiritual texts, we understand that the soul is eternal, and well, we're souls, so that means that we, at our essence, are eternal beings. You see, this is the whole of spiritual practice, of spirituality itself, that we learn to maintain our identity as a soul somewhere in our thinking. Ultimately, all spiritual paths lead to our death. We are preparing for our transition into the next phase, and keeping that soul identity, keeping thoughts of God at the forefront of our minds will be vital during this transition. We want our minds to be light and positive as we move into the next phase. And yes, I understand how Heaven's Gate-esque that sounds, but yeah, Marshall Applewhite and many other so-called cult leaders were correct about one thing. We are in a process of transition. Our physical form is decaying. We are dying right now. And the more time we spend contemplating that, the better prepared we'll be at the end of this phase. Now, there is a reason all of these systems incorporate some form of contemplative practice around death into their curriculum. If you believe that you are your physical body, then this is really bad news. You won't get out of this alive, at least if the you think you are is the body. Notice my use of the word think. This goes beyond the thinking mind. It's deeper than that. Remember, anytime we anchor ourselves to this material reality, we will experience suffering. Yes, pain will happen, but the suffering of life can be mitigated through adjustments in how our mind perceives reality. And this is done through spiritual practice. Now, Buddha taught us that we suffer because the mind believes that the world is solid. It believes that it's fixed in time, stationary and permanent, despite the fact that you could ask the question of anyone, do you believe all things are permanent? And their answer obviously would be no. Either way, they will still suffer due to the mind's assumption of permanence, and that assumption of permanence will affect the nervous system. And if this person, despite knowing that nothing is permanent, if they have not worked to move through physical senses, learn to deny the senses, learn to deny the nervous system, then they will just continue to get caught up in these things. And, some things are obviously worse than others, and depending on the person, that also depends as well. It's very relative. The divine mind, the mind of the soul, however, knows better. That mind, the divine mind, is fearless and connected. Anytime we are in the conscious mind, the fearful carnal mind, as Florence Scovel Shen would say, then we're experiencing the thoughts of the body and then perceiving the phenomenon of consensus reality from the material world. What we're talking about today takes us out of the body, quite literally. That said, we still need our conscious mind to reprogram the subconscious mind, the mind that we bring with us. Remember, the mind is a fantastic tool, but it is a terrible master. So what we're discussing today requires imagination, the imaging faculty of the mind. This is why engaging the imagination is so important. Imagination is a vital spiritual tool. Now, something that always bothered me as a kid. and I remember this concern very vividly, was that the descriptions of heaven often focused on things like gold, mansions, lakes of fire. These descriptions of the so-called afterlife always used earthly elements in a heavenly context, and that struck me as odd. I remember when I was a kid and I became familiar with the concept of things that were the metaphysics and the metaphysical. So I'd ask, why are physical earthly elements involved in a metaphysical heavenly place? So if this is something outside the body, outside of time and space, then what's with the big houses? Who gives a shit? Well, as I mentioned before, at that point, I was already reading about the paranormal and questioning things, and it just didn't add up. Also, you have to remember that I was dealing with a sect of Christianity that believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible. It wasn't like they thought that the mansions and the gold streets and the fire were allegories. They literally believed that you'd receive a mansion in some heavenly subdivision with streets paved with gold, I guess. Now, something that Lama Losan once said to me was that at the time of death, everyone is a snowflake in a blizzard, meaning that there's a lot of confusion and potential distress. As best I can imagine, it's probably akin to the confusion I've felt when I've been too high. And if that's the case, well, let's just hope that's not the case. Let's just say that if time is a construct, I need that construct. I don't do well in those situations. I guess that's why we're taught that you want a death that you can be conscious of. They say sudden deaths are the hardest and fraught with confusion. But if we can remain conscious and aware of the transition, and if we've done our homework, we stand a chance of mitigating the confusion that accompanies this massive shift. So think about this for a second. You know that the widget analogy I use all the time about how we're just told what things are. Well, I'll try to be brief, but consider a chair. We're taught early on what a chair is, what to call it, and how to interact with it. Over time, this understanding became an implicit memory. You approach a chair and sit. There's no thought involved. Now, you don't have to consider what a chair is every time you approach it. You just walk up to it, your ass goes here, your back goes here. Now, apply that to the world. What implicit memories do you have about how to interact with the world? Other objects, people, food, everything. Now, consider how much your physical body as a data collection device plays into your understanding of the world. Essentially, you know what the world is because of your human body. Now imagine not having that. When that happens, everything is different. So here's where it gets a bit strange and slippery. This is obviously my understanding of things and is by no means the be-all, end-all understanding of this topic. So please don't take any of this as hubris. But if the mind is, in many ways, intertwined with the subtle body, then that means it stays with us once we've dropped our physical body and transitioned. If that's the case, then that's where the problems occur. If the mind is not informed of what the true nature of this whole human experience is, if it's not taught adequate dharma, then how could it make this transition? The scariest thing is those who have no predilection towards spiritual practice of any kind, those who live solely in the material world with no knowledge of the higher self or higher realities. Second would be those who have only the information but no integration of this knowledge, no practice or discipline rooted in some spiritual path. Even still, those of us with a dedicated practice could still possibly struggle once the body is no longer needed. But just consider that, like, having this knowledge, understanding the place that the body has in this, and that's going to aid you wildly during this transition. And this mind, right, that we have, it's very powerful. And the mind, if the mind is not geared towards spiritual thinking, if the cognitive faculties are not guided by spiritual wisdom, then we as souls can become lost. especially if the material world is no longer being sensed by the body. Again, think about how much the body plays into your perception of things. The mind will draw the soul into confusion at that point. This is when we hear about lost souls that have not passed on and remain with a foot in this realm and a foot in the astral realm. You see, if the mind is closely identified with this body and believes that it is the body, then at the time of bodily death, it will remain attached to the world of the senses. This is the confusion of the mind. Remember, suffering is rooted in the belief that the world is a solid, permanent thing, that your experience is a solid, permanent thing, that you are a solid, permanent thing. Now that we understand all that, let's get into it. What's a ghost? Is ghost the right word? The truth is, I don't know. I've encountered this phenomenon my entire life, and I've always had these opinions and ideas about what happens after the body dies. But in the last year and a half, most of those opinions and theories got upended. I mean, after my dad died, I'd have these dreams that involved him, and they were wonderful, and they're much different than my normal dreams. I think most folks have had that experience with certain dreams that they felt like they had mass. Mass is the best word I can think of. They felt like they had mass. Like they were more physically substantial, I guess you could say. And my mom would have her experiences with seeing my dad on the porch looking at the river and things like that. And I guess I just thought, well, that's his subtle body, still manifesting in a physical form, or seemingly physical, just still wandering around kind of like a husk. And that's what I thought a lot of, ghosts, quote unquote ghosts were. And his soul had probably moved on. I also figured that the strange things that happened in the first year after he died in that house were just him trying to figure out what to do, where to go, or honestly, if he was even dead. And maybe it was him trying to communicate with us. I just don't know. Sometimes my cousin, who has a gift, her name's Carrie, and she has a gift for communicating with those who have passed on. I guess that's the best way to say it, would tell me things about others that had passed on. And then I kind of run that through this filter of mine, and it didn't make any sense. In fact, I'd actually push back and try to understand in my own way, but it's like I was so attached to my understanding that I had trouble reckoning with what she was saying. And then eventually my mom died, and I didn't have any experiences around her, honestly. I mean, I've had a few dreams, but nothing like with my dad. Well, actually, there's one story. Trauma responses, anxiety, ruminating thinking, grief and loss, stress, these are all reoccurring patterns in the mind. They're often the result of reacting the same way over and over again. Why do we do this? Because the mind believes the past is still here, happening now, causing the nervous system to respond accordingly. What the mind perceives, the body feels. Mind transformation and restructuring, MTR, offers a pathway to release these patterns. It guides both the mind and the nervous system out of these repetitive cycles and into a lighter, freer way of being. If this resonates with you, feel free to reach out via direct message or through the contact section at theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. You don't have to live the way you've been living. Change is possible. Actually, so after my mom died, a month or so later, my girlfriend at the time, and we split up, and I had to live in a few Airbnbs for a little bit while I was looking for a house. And in hindsight, it was a rough time, but in the moment, I think I was so shut down to my own feelings that I guess I thought I was fine. Like I said, in hindsight, I absolutely was not. Well, one night, I was sitting in my car in the dark in front of the place I was staying. I'd just gotten home. I'd been running or something, but I just didn't want to move. I was so emotionally exhausted and depressed, and I was just hitting a wall, and my dog Henry was staring at me through this window, and I was just staring back at him. We're just looking at each other. And At this time, I hadn't really been talking to people unless I had to. Like I was talking to people at work and stuff like that. I'd kind of fallen off the radar with family. Again, hindsight, this was bad. I was having some pretty dark thoughts. But at the time, I was so sick that they seemed perfectly logical. Suicide just kind of made sense to me. And I remember sitting there and having the thought for the first time that the people who loved me the most in this world are dead. And I had no kids. I had a dog. And really, Henry was the only logical reason I could find to stay on Earth. So I'm sitting there staring at him through this window, and I thought, fuck, I need to call someone. And I thought I should call Carrie. Well, right then my phone rang and I looked down and it's Carrie. And I remember crying a bit and laughing. So I answered the phone and she says, "Your mom told me to call you. She said you're having a hard time." Now, what the fuck was that? I hadn't talked to Carrie in months, weeks, whatever. She didn't know I was having a hard time. And, telling that story right now makes me sad. I can still feel the sadness that I felt, and I remember it very clearly. Well, fast forward about 3 or 4 years, Christy understands that sadness. She's been there, and that's helpful for me. She understands that particular flavor of sadness. Anyway, before this turns into a podcast about sadness, so in the last year and a half, my experiences with the phenomena in all forms have ramped up and actually changed my perception of things. Also, if the term phenomena seems strange, just go back a few episodes. Anyway, the way I see it now is that we look at this as if we die and go somewhere, right? That even if you have the idea of life after death, I die and then I go somewhere else. But we don't really go anywhere per se. It's a dimensional thing. We don't die. We just don't have the literal weight of a human body anymore. And I think for some, it's easier to take advantage of that freedom of movement, we'll say, than others. If the mind is negative and geared toward sense gratification, then it's probably really difficult. You're weighed down by all these heavy attachments. For instance, to use a very exaggerated example, if you're obsessed with your car, like your entire identity is your car, your ego structure is geared towards your car. The way you value yourself, the way you value others is kind of done through a car. Well, what if you no longer had a car? If cars were no longer useful and as a society, we couldn't use them anymore, or the grid shut, or whatever it is, like you'd be crushed. If you were that person, you'd have to reorient your entire mind to this reality, and that could take a lot of time. And I think that's kind of what happens at the time of death. The mind, which is attached to the soul, has to reorient itself. I think that there's, if you're someone who had a lot of attachments, even to family, and not to say that you can detach from your family, but it can be easier if you have sort of an understanding of the metaphysics of things. And I know this is far-fetched and in no way applicable to the real world. But, what if your entire reality was a political ideology or a religious one, and one day you found out that it was all this very subjective, conceptual thing that didn't really have any hard objective truth behind it? Like maybe it was all just a weird groupthink control mechanism. And then you realized that all of your experiences were nothing more than a projection of your own attractions and aversions. That would be wild. Then you'd have to deal with the allegory that pops up in all spiritual literature, where you are exiled to the forest to wander around and refigure things out. Or you're now forced to wander the desert as opposed to living under the tyrannical rule of a pharaoh of your old ways of thinking. That'd be weird, right? Now extrapolate from there. This bodily death could be rough if your mind is confused, if you're attached to ideas, if you're attached to certain things. Like, it's going to be difficult. It's funny when I think of my mom and dad. One was very much a Christian, and the other just had a loose belief about things. In fact, I remember once asking my dad why he didn't go to church with us, and he said, "Son, the man upstairs and I have a special understanding." And you know what? I kind of think he did. His life was fucking unbelievable. Either way, for some reason, I see them as being okay with it. In fact, I feel it. I feel it deeply, especially based on experiences I've had over the last year or so. I know that they're okay and making the most of this interdimensionality because they seem to be popping in and out of my reality very often. I think they figured it out. I think that others, like my grandmother on my mom's side, helped them. We were told once that our grandmother helps people cross over. We were told. And on that note, that's another thing that I used to struggle with, the idea of mediumship. But after my experience with Reverend Margaret Schmidt, I have no doubt that the real deal does exist, and that it is possible. In fact, I feel that so deeply that she made it into my gratitude list for Thanksgiving. I mean, that meeting that I had with her changed my life. This is what I'm saying. This year has changed everything. You know, I think the most exciting thing about pursuing spiritual knowledge is that you're always having to throw away old ideas. And that's a really cool thing. If you truly desire to learn and grow, then it's awesome. If not, it sucks, I guess, because like I said, you'd be exiled to the forest. Often, you'd have to be exiled to the forest and re-enter your kingdom of quote unquote knowing, but I don't mind. I don't mind wandering the forest. I don't mind being lost in the desert. I'm in good company in that regard, right? The Pandavas had to do it in the Mahabharata, and Rama had to do it in the Ramayana. So I'll gladly do it as much as I can. So yeah, I feel that some drop their body and learn to move freely. And it's hard for us to reconcile, we try to make sense of it through our very linear way of perceiving. We're in a human body that has to see things from a very linear perspective. But I just don't think that matters once we're out of the body. I also tend to think that based on other paranormal phenomena, such as time slips and things of that nature, that time, this doesn't sound crazy, but that time might be a substance. We experience this substance through the human body, but without a human body, it's no longer a factor. We don't experience that substance of time. I mean, maybe it's like water in a river, but it's a river that we only really lay in when we're in a body, I mean, it's really just decomposition of form, right? That's what time is. It's this decomposition of form, but without form, there's no age. There's nothing decomposing. There's no name. There's no political. There's nothing. There's no sun, seasons, or time. It's an irrelevant thing at that point. I look at something like the Tibetan Buddhist model presented in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I just don't think it's that accurate. I mean, maybe it is. I can certainly see where aspects of it are probably correct, but the idea that we transmigrate into our next birth in 48 days seems, again, a bit too linear. Like, what's 48 days if time's not a thing that we abide by once we're out of the body? I do believe that we take rebirth, but I don't see it as this punishment reward kind of thing. And I certainly don't see it as this conveyor belt of souls that are so thoughtless and led by desire that they just continually fall into another birth over and over and over again as it gets described to us in the East. I mean, I suppose if you're attached and confused and have absolutely no knowledge or understanding of these things whatsoever, I could see where you might just go toward that quote unquote gateway that gets described. So we're left with this knowledge that we don't die. We might not be left with a human form to inhabit, but our mind, our consciousness is still very much intact and freed from having to perceive through this filter of the human body. In essence, we wake up. We go back to our interdimensional identity, the soul. I believe that's the link between the UFO phenomenon and the afterlife. The link is the knowledge that we don't die. We go on living. And this material reality is a school where the soul grows. I think for some, it's a pleasant process of waking up. Just like on this plane, waking up can be fun. However, for others who have tangled themselves up in the world of form, the formless is going to be confusing. The suffering they experience here will only follow them to the other side. But I do believe that there is guidance on both sides, available to all if they are willing to accept it. On that note, we've been doing this a long time, you and I. And I love you, I love you, I love you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you want to know more about this, you guys can always reach out to me. Okay, bye. If you enjoyed this content and would like to support its creation, visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. There you can explore the various ways to get involved and support this work. Click the About button, read a little bit about me, and see what I have to offer you through the one-on-one sessions. Don't forget to check out the Patreon tiers, where we're building a community of everyday people with not so everyday interests. You'll also find the online apparel store. And as always, head over to the participate button and join us. Together, we're growing a community of spiritual seekers just like you.